Human decisions made in the next decade will have consequences for the Earth, for ecosystems, and for human beings for the next 10,000 years. How best to use that time?
We've breached that tipping point, and we are just beginning to feel what we have done.
In a way, I think that this crisis is a crisis of not having listened deeply, and still not listening deeply to this Earth.
We have to insist, not just in our private conversations, in public spaces, that there is deeper work to be done.
And we're not going to solve this problem unless we can act together mutually and effectively.
Failure is not an option. So what remains is to envision our way forward.
We can grow from this experience.
Species extinction, the sixth great extinction, gathering speed.
Extreme extraction by incredibly lucrative and powerful industries.
Enormous fluctuations in temperature and the weather systems. Melting polar ice caps.
Increased food insecurity, crops are failing.
Water shortage or less arable land, the entire refugee crisis.
Epic drought and the erosion of the coastline.
Small, defenseless, sentient beings are losing their homes.
Deoxygenation of the oceans, in addition to acidification and warming.
An incredible failure of leadership and the gap between science and policy.
Why do I think this is happening? I would maybe start with colonialism and conquest and empire and a rise of a disconnected way of thinking that has people outside of nature and not embedded in a planet and not responsible to each other or to future generations.
Consumption. We have gotten ourselves into a self-reinforcing process of wanting more. It's like an addiction, except people feel it's their right.
Yes, we are complicit. We have forgotten who we are. And it's almost like we got hit with a bad case of amnesia and started behaving really badly.
Fear.
Narcissism. We prize competition way more than altruism. And our culture has allowed this imbalance.
And we exhibit all the traits of an ego-driven adolescent.
The big corporate interests are playing out the end of the world. And because we've bought into it, we're not standing up to stop them.
Yeah, that's where I was going, to the logic of capitalism taken to its extreme.
Where did the listening go? Being in the world from a position of listening. So many earlier peoples were in a sacred kind of a dance, which acknowledged our interdependent nature and reality.
I think historically, you can trace the beginnings of this to agriculture and having to figure out a system of how do we pass the land on. Things become ownership and property, including women. And now we're emerging from that. Women are rising again and standing in their power. And so that voice of life-giving and nurture, cooperation versus competition, has a voice again.
I was talking to a psychologist recently who described human beings as constant risk assessors. Every time we walk into a new environment, he said you can measure this, that our whole physiology, our eyes look for threats, and our bodies are sensing if the place is safe, and perhaps some of what we see is a giant search for safety gone awry. I mean, we're all seeking safety, comfort, and ease, and we've just been allowed by the basis of our capabilities as human beings to take that to an extreme, and to the extreme that we're no longer safe, we're no longer going to be comfortable, and we're no longer going to be at ease. And when you think about each of us are doing that all the time, then some of the dysfunctionality becomes somewhat understandable. But then where do you go from there? How do you interact with creatures who are afraid, and maybe speak to that part of them to help them understand that it's much safer to be sustainable. It's a happier world in the way that Beth described. So maybe there's some way to leverage that animal being in us.
It occurred to me fairly recently. One of the odd things about human beings is our capacity to treat other human beings as belonging to a different species. And in a sense, it's the willingness to do that that undermines our sense of being part of a larger whole, in which we think about the future and other people's children and the health of the planet. We set up these oppositions as ways of affirming our own identities, our own egos. And in that sense, war with other nations and exploitation of the environment are the same problem. They're the same failure to say, we're in this together. It's something we're not good at saying. We say we're in this against each other again and again.
It's this really long story that we're telling of disconnection. And so here we are in the last 10 years, maybe, that matter out of a 500, 1,000 year story. And I'm just noticing how much in me is the instinct to solve it, turn it around, as though we're going to all together understand what happened and choose a different course. And that's how I think almost all the time, that's the job that we have to do. And that's what all these global processes and COPs and treaties and education is all about. But I don't know. I mean, this is also just evolution of an animal. And I don't know if it changes in that kind of planned sort of way. And so maybe one of the most useful things to do with these 10 years that we're talking about is understand what went wrong and support the pockets, because there are all these pockets of resistance, right? It's not as though indigenous people left the face of the earth. And one of our first circles, I think it was Kathleen, talked about refugia, the little pockets of things that survive. And something about initial conditions. So there were some really bad initial conditions centuries ago, and it's really hard to get out of the grooves those have dug, what are the initial conditions that we should be trying to seed? That's the question that this leads me to.
The whole process is going to happen in ways that we don't know. One day you wake up and something is really different. So I feel as though, however this unfolds, it will be in certain kinds of surprise, and that things in the natural world are altering and recomposing both at once.
I don't know what's going to happen to governments and governance. You know, already we have oligarchies. We don't really have democratic governments anymore. So I think we'll see that accelerate in some way.
One way or another, either gracefully or kicking and screaming, we're going to have to, as a culture, think deeply about our core values. Values like individualism versus interdependence. Values like competition versus compassion. And to begin to think in terms of a paradigm shift. What has been coming into my experience is the importance of embodiment. People aren't only looking for knowledge, they're also looking for examples of compassion, examples of presence, and a way to think about that, how that intersects with contemporary issues and real life problems that people are having in their everyday existence, including problems related to climate change and just despair around climate change and how to hold it. So embodying, holding that is a radical act. So I do see some of my contribution as just being with others, holding that as an actual practice and as a foundation for action.
Where I see a lot of potential is that we stop being these solo players and bring our forces and our skills and capacities and resources together so that we bring about bigger change. Connecting people, building coalitions, countering all these disconnects that we have in our lives from nature and from each other. Being that glue in between to be that feedback loop so that people know what's going on when they take this action, what it does in other places. To me, that feels, that can speed up change.
I come to the same conclusions that Susie has, but I won't stop there. When audiences at the end of a talk ask me, well, what can one person do? My answer always is stop being one person and form into the kind of coalitions that you're talking about. And you're right. We each of us sometimes think, I have to save the world, but of course we don't. We're in this great swelling wave of affirmation of new ways of living, and forming coalitions with others is joyous, is a way of making the work joyous. The other coalition, of course, is with the natural world, and the natural world is our partner in all of this work in two ways. One is it gives us strength and courage. I mean, we go out to see the geese and we suddenly understand this is why I'm doing this work. The other thing that it does for us is that it shows us models of courage and resilience. I mean, if you just take a piece of land and stop wrecking it, it will show you what it means to be resilient and what it means to grow back up in the fullness of beauty. So looking outside of ourselves is a model for how to go forward. But as for me, I think that I have to be a storyteller and that there are particular stories that need to be told, and I'll just list them. We have to tell stories of the radical imagination. We have to imagine this new world into existence. It can't all be a dystopia. And then finally, what I'll be writing most is these broken-hearted hallelujahs. Leonard Cohen's song, I think, is exactly right. There is so much to be saved. There is so much at risk. There is so much that we love too much to lose. Let's sing the songs of those, even though it breaks our heart. And that's how I kind of try to think of my work. My work is to try to open people's hearts without breaking them. So that's the kind of truth-telling that I think we have to do.
You know, if you look at the long span of human evolution, one of the things that was essential was creating a period of extreme dependency. This is a remarkable fact about human beings that goes with our plasticity. We've all, at some level, experienced being totally dependent, learning to trust. And this is a major contrast with other species. But on the other hand, we keep inventing systems that say the thing you want to get away from is depending on other people. That full maturity must be standing on your own 2 feet. And we now live in a society that is instructing us not to trust each other. And that, it seems to me, is the central danger, is this insistence on being self-determining instead of interdetermining.
When we're born, the very first thing a child does is seek out the comfort of a parent's eyes and embrace and nurturing. And that seeking, I think, continues. That of all the characteristics that evolved as human beings became who we are, I think perhaps the primary one is the ability to cooperate and plan collaboratively for the common good, and to think of ourselves as part of a whole, I think is essential to our happiness. I think we seek not only connection with other beings, but also connection with some sort of force that is bigger than we are, and that this also has evolved as being an important part of us. And whether that's the earth or a divinity, it doesn't seem to matter. It's just that kind of yearning. And so we're creatures of yearning for connection, I believe. And that view of human nature does not work for capitalism. Capitalism cannot abide that view. For capitalism to work, we have to be individuals in competition. There have to be winners and losers. There have to be individual consumers. And we have to find our fulfillment in things, in connection to things rather than one another. So we are fed constantly, continually, a story that's different from the story that we know. And I think the result is a profound grief at being denied what are truly and essentially the sources of our comfort and solace, and to live finally in a world that is constructed for separation. The single-family home, the car, the bathrooms are all structures of separation. And why is that? It's not an accident. It's the requirement of capitalism. That's what I believe.
Where's the feminine? Where's the heart? Where's the yearning? All those things that capitalism is writing out of the picture. It seems to me now so right that we are women doing this work. There's a piece of work of healing, of recovery, of knowing a different way and kind of knowing that has to come from the heart.
I agree completely with what she said about capitalism. And there are so many systems of control, and I want to sit down with people who feel like they need to control everything. You know, where does that come from? Maybe it is as early as, you know, wanting to know what's going to happen when I go in my cave tonight. You know, is the fire going to be there, and is the food going to be there? Maybe it's that old. but I know that there are still many people on this planet who have a sense of who they are and what their place is in this sphere that we call planet Earth. And I think part of the task is allowing those voices to be heard.
As you were talking, what was coming to me as my expression of who we are is that we are awake. We are wild, free, animal Buddhas. Somehow. Buddha means the one that is awake, actually. Just that's all it means. So one part of us is awake. One part of us knows that we are connected. One part of us knows, the part that is a child still, knows that we are free. And some other part of us is disconnected, confused, and is forgotten. So who we are awake, and have forgotten that we are awake.
When I think of Homo sapiens, being a biologist, I think of us as a species, almost first as a species. And that's just my perspective of looking at it from my background. You know, we're part of every ecosystem on the planet now. If we were observing some other species doing the same thing, the first thing we want to do is call them, right? It is a prevalent fear that I have, that when the dangers of our impact on the planet is realized, that is sort of the natural take on things. So how do we get beyond that? And I think all of you have said things that just resonate with me so profoundly, this competition versus this cooperation in the community sense. And I'm going to end this with a question, but how do we reward altruism? I keep bringing this up, but I talk about, the good people. They're all around us and they're overlooked because we glorify the competitors and not the people with altruism. So as a primate, I don't know how to close that, but I find this to be a remarkable question. I'd like to hear more.
I think silence and deep listening is active revolutionary insurrection against the capitalist messages. Like, I'm not going to look at your ads. I'm not going to listen to all the ways that I'm not good enough because I don't have some product or thing. And then in the process, it's a way to discover my connection with myself and my connection with others. So it's doubly revolutionary.
We use noise as a way of avoiding listening, as a way of avoiding knowing. And often cocooned noise with earphones, So we literally can't hear other people. And so I think the fact that a discussion of deep listening is moving through the society is a good sign. We become more resistant to advertising and more open to the feelings of other people and their opinions and learning new things. And your job is to take it in, be open, welcome it, so that what we learn, what we encounter, whether it's painful or joyful, expands our world instead of limiting it by building up defenses against it.
I think what we might discover is an endless, profound grief cry that we've been disconnected for so long. So for me, in the silence is the potential, the great gift of healing. So if we just stood still long enough to bear that, and if we were willing to experience the grief of having been separated, maybe from that we could begin to heal it.
Every time I pause in this way, even in this council, I find the power of the non-conceptual, this quiet part of ourselves that is not thinking, but just being. And love lives in that domain of the non-conceptual. Love is a feeling, not a thought. So for me also, this practice of pausing is an immediate invitation into love.
I'm incredibly thankful for the gift that my grandfather gave me. From about the age of 5 till I was 13, every day I had to go sit outside. And I wasn't allowed to move more than the circumference of my arms. And my favorite spot was under this big maple tree on a picnic bench. And I would sit and watch. And after an hour, he'd call me in and say, "What did you see?" Every day. Snow, it didn't matter. Rain, it didn't matter. You sat. And it's such a gift. As an artist, I feel like silence and pausing are so necessary because it opens that door. It's this threshold, I picture it clearly, where there is this great darkness. And I say that in the most profound, beautiful way, that everything is possible beyond this door. And I almost see myself as an antenna, just waiting for signal through this door. And then maybe that's inspiration or information, but that's what happens in that silence and that listening and the pause. And I've shared with you that for the last almost year, that's what I've been doing, is waiting for signal. And I know the signal's coming. I feel them. I just haven't been able to piece together what the message is. But it's pretty awesome.
I think the quality of interruption sort of allies with something you said, Beth, about revolution. That to become silent and to pause is to interrupt. Our situation and allow all that has been lost to re-enter, all that has been submerged, and all that is fresh and new and present in the moment and full of possibility, vibrant, letting us be one with the wonder that we are and that the world is infinite and ever replenishing. And we may make our way in a new way from there. Why is it so important right now?
Why is it necessary to continue? I think the answer to that is pretty straightforward, and the answer then would be love. That we love what is at stake, and we won't let it fray and fall apart. And it's easy to think of love as a kind of la-di-da, skip it through the tulips kind of thing, but love is a sacred trust. And it's this ferocious determination to save or serve the interests of the object of your love. So I think that's the easy question. How, I think, is harder. It's going to take moral courage, which is not the same as fearlessness. Courage is doing it even though you are afraid. So that's, I think, what we have to summon is the courage, which is maybe just stubbornness, but is the courage to do what we think is right, even if we can't save the planet. We do what's right because we think it's right. And the courage to, in every way we can, defend what we love, even if it breaks our hearts.
What if we looked back and said, that was the time of the great learning. That was the time when all of these unimaginable challenges beset us, and we had terrible tragedies and profound loss and sadness. And instead of turning against each other and fighting for the very last scraps, we realized that we had to relearn what our place was in the long sweep of geological time, in the biological system of expanding and contracting and culling. And we saw, finally, the mistake that we had made by believing that we were separate and special and other and over. We saw it, we learned from it, we learned from the rest of the world, and we began to rebuild with humility, understanding that if we lost the ability to love, then there was no point in going on.
I think the why for me is because I'm fully aware that I'm made of the material of this place, that I am an earthling, that this is my place in space. There is no place like it. And then I feel like I have to channel my grandfather, because it's something he told all of his grandkids before he died. He sat us down and he said, I don't want to cry when I do this. He said, you are billions of years in the making, and you carry the wisdom of your ancestors within you. And you can access that at any time. He said, you are born of this time, for this time, and there is no one like you. And you must do what you were put here to do, uniquely. And your job is to figure out what that is. He said, you have survived genocide, slavery, and disease. And yet here you are. If that's not a why and a how, I don't know. Does it make it any easier? I don't despair. I know that life always finds a way. It may not be our Homo sapiens sapien that continues, and I'm honestly, I'm okay with that. I'm okay because I understand the long tail of time and geology, and knowing that all things lead to their end. And when you know that things are finite, then you start to appreciate them. Then you start to say, well, what are we doing while we are here? I tell my friends, no minute on this planet is guaranteed. You have no guarantee that you can say, I'll be there next year or even next week. So what are you going to do in this moment with who you are and what you have? How will you serve? Because we all live in service to each other, whether we acknowledge that or not. A king, an emperor, a politician lives in service to constituents. We like the illusion that we are in competition, that we are individual, that we are somehow isolated and separate, but it's an illusion. It's not true. And so how do you remind people gently that we serve each other? And that's where joy is, in service. How shall I serve is what I ask every morning when I wake up. How shall I serve? How does that manifest?
Why? Kathy said, love. How could we not? How could we not? How could we not? And what is required to sustain? What comes to me is wisdom, especially the wisdom to listen deeply to the truth, to hold that truth with grace, or those truths with grace. And then compassion, but not the kind of compassion that I think in our culture we often think of. When we think of compassion, we think of softness and yielding, but not that kind of compassion, but fierce compassion. A compassion that is interested and draws near to suffering with curiosity and with love. There's an archetype that we find in the Buddhist tradition called a bodhisattva. And that word is sometimes translated as the loving warrior, the one who serves. So when I hear Camille's, how can I serve? That is the vow of the archetype of fierce compassion. The mantra is, how can I serve? And doing the inner work, I think of that as just returning home and remembering who we truly are, coming home to that truth that we are wild and free, that we are awake. And if we're awake, we must carry out that ethic of the bodhisattva, being a creature in interdependence and acting on behalf of the planet. That is our calling. If that's not our calling, why are we here?